Stand on the eastern shore of Bali and look across the water. 20 miles away, you can see Lombok, close enough to make out the shapes of hills, close enough that a fishing boat can cross in a couple of hours. The two islands look identical, tropical, volcanic, covered in the same green vegetation. Yet biologically, they might as well be on different planets. Cross that 20-mile gap and tigers vanish, replaced by marsupials. Monkeys disappear, cockatoos take over the sky. The divide isn't gradual, it's absolute, as if someone carved the world in half and forbade anything from crossing. This is the Wallace Line, and for millions of years, it has been Earth's most effective cage. The strait between Bali and Lombok is narrower than the distance between Dover and Calais. On a clear morning, you can stand on one shore and watch the sun rise over the other. Birds fly overhead constantly. The water itself looks unremarkable, blue, calm in the sheltered bays, choppy where the current runs. Nothing about the physical appearance of this channel suggests it should matter more than any other patch of ocean in the Indonesian archipelago. But step off a boat onto Bali's beaches and you enter a world of Asian jungle. The forests echo with the whooping calls of gibbons. Macaque monkeys raid fruit trees in temple courtyards. Until the 20th century, tigers prowled these same forests. The Bali tiger, genetically identical to the cats that hunt in India and Sumatra. Woodpeckers drill into hardwood trees. Barbets call from the canopy. Asian elephants once grazed in the lowlands. Leopards stalked deer through the undergrowth. This is textbook tropical Asia, the same ecological community you'd find in Thailand or Borneo. Cross to Lombok and the Asian rulebook stops applying. The tigers are gone, not just extinct, but absent from the fossil record entirely. No tiger ever walked on Lombok. Monkeys persist here, but they're likely introductions, carried by humans. The native mammals are marsupials, cuscus, with their slow, wide-eyed stares and prehensile tails, moving through trees like furry sloths. The birds shift from Asian barbets to Australian cockatoos, white shrieking flocks that would look at home in Sydney. Instead of woodpeckers, you find megapodes, odd, chicken-like birds that don't sit on their eggs, but bury them in warm volcanic sand or compost heaps, letting geothermal heat do the incubation. The contrast applies to every branch of the evolutionary tree. Freshwater fish on Bali are Asian carp and catfish. On Lombok, they're different families entirely. The percentage is stark. Over half the mammal species found east of this line exist nowhere else on Earth. They evolved in isolation from their neighbors just 20 miles away. The distance between England and France is 21 miles. Historically, before humans reshaped the landscape, badgers, foxes, and deer lived on both sides. The same species, moving back and forth freely until the last ice age ended. The biological difference between the two shores was minimal to non-existent. The distance between Bali and Lombok is 20 miles. The biological difference is a continental divide. Alfred Russel Wallace arrived in Singapore in April 1854 with a specific unglamorous mission: collect beetles. He wasn't funded by a university or a wealthy patron conducting research for its own sake. Wallace was working class, self-taught, and he made his living by shooting, trapping, skinning, and preserving exotic animals to sell to European collectors who would never leave their parlors. The more spectacular the specimen, the higher the price. An unusual butterfly might fetch enough to fund a month of travel. A rare bird of paradise could pay for 6 months. His plan was simple: spend a few years in the Malay archipelago, gather enough specimens to sell, and return to England with enough money to write a book. He stayed 8 years. By the time he left in 1862, he had collected 125,660 specimens. 83,200 were beetles. He traveled 14,000 miles between islands, hopping from Sumatra to Borneo to Sulawesi to the Moluccas to New Guinea and back. The obsessive cataloging revealed a pattern. On Borneo, he found orangutans, gibbons, flying squirrels, and a riot of Asian jungle life. On New Guinea, just a few hundred miles east, orangutans were replaced by tree kangaroos. The gibbons vanished. Parrots took over from Asian songbirds. These weren't minor variations. They were wholesale substitutions of entire animal communities. The sharpest edge of that pattern cut through a strait he could see across. Wallace crossed from Bali to Lombok in the mid-1850s. His journals record immediate confusion. He expected Lombok to mirror Bali. The islands were neighbors, visible from each other's shores, sitting in the same climate. but the orange-colored thrush he'd been observing on Bali simply wasn't there. The woodpeckers were gone. The barbets, gone. In their place were white cockatoos, loud and conspicuous, and megapodes scratching in the leaf litter. He wrote that the change felt less like traveling between islands and more like crossing into a different country entirely, except the shift was deeper than any national border. This was a biological hard cut. Wallace had no immediate explanation. He kept collecting, kept counting, and kept noticing that the divide applied to almost everything. Butterflies shifted, mammals shifted. The trees themselves began to change composition on the eastern islands. He was methodical enough to see that this wasn't noise or coincidence. Some invisible rule was being enforced. The answer wasn't visible from the surface. It required looking at the Earth not as it is now, but as it was. The Sunda Shelf is a broad, shallow platform of continental crust extending southeast from mainland Asia. It connects the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and Bali beneath relatively shallow seas. In most places, the water here is less than 200 feet deep. That depth matters because sea level isn't fixed. It rises and falls with the planet's climate, and during the coldest stretches of the ice ages, it fell dramatically. During glacial maximums, the point when Earth's ice caps hold the maximum amount of frozen water, sea levels dropped by approximately 390 feet. The shallow seas covering the Sunda Shelf drained away. What are now separate islands merged into a single, continuous landmass connected directly to Thailand, Vietnam, and the rest of Southeast Asia. Geologists call this expanded landmass Sundaland. For tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, and every other large Asian mammal, this was a highway. They didn't need to swim. They didn't need boats. They could walk from the banks of the Mekong River all the way to the eastern coast of Bali without ever encountering deep water. And they did, repeatedly, for over 2 million years, until they hit the edge. To the east lies the Sahul Shelf, the Australian equivalent, connecting Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single landmass during glacial periods. Between the two shelves lies a gap, not a shallow sea that drains when the ice caps grow, but a deep trench that remains full of water even at the lowest points of Ice Age sea level. The Lombok Strait sits directly over a subduction zone, a place where two tectonic plates collide and one is forced down beneath the other into the Earth's mantle. The collision creates a gouge in the ocean floor. Even when sea levels dropped 390 feet, this channel remained over 1,000 feet deep in places. It never drained. It never froze. It never formed a bridge. The Indonesian through-flow adds a second layer of difficulty. This is one of the planet's major ocean currents, moving vast quantities of warm water from the Pacific Ocean through the Indonesian islands into the Indian Ocean. The Lombok Strait is one of its main channels. The current rips through the gap at speeds that would sweep any swimming animal out into open ocean. A tiger attempting to cross would drown or be carried so far offshore that land would disappear over the horizon before exhaustion took over. The trench is the locked door. For over 40 million years, it has stayed locked. The climate of the Pleistocene, the epoch spanning the last 2.6 million years, was unstable. Earth cycled between glacial and interglacial periods roughly every 100,000 years. Ice sheets expanded from the poles, locking water into glaciers 2 miles thick over what is now Canada and Scandinavia. Sea levels dropped. Then the cycle reversed. Ice melted, oceans rose, coastlines drowned. For the animals of Sundaland, each glacial period was an invitation. The Sunda Shelf drained, and the land bridge opened. Tigers moved east. So did elephants, rhinoceroses, tapirs, deer, leopards, and hundreds of smaller species. They spread across the exposed land, following river valleys and forest corridors, reaching new territory that had been locked away underwater during the previous warm period. Bali was as far east as the highway went. Stand on the eastern cliffs of Bali during a glacial maximum, and you'd be standing at the literal edge of the continent. Beyond that point, the land ended and the ocean began. Not a shallow ford or a narrow channel, but a deep, fast-moving strait that no land animal could cross without the ability to swim miles in open water against a current designed to shove you sideways into oblivion. The tigers reached this edge. They stopped. They turned back, or they settled into the forests behind them, or they died attempting the crossing. When the glaciers melted and sea levels rose again, the land bridge flooded. The tigers on Bali were now isolated on an island, cut off from their relatives on Java and Sumatra. But the isolation worked only one way, backward toward the continent they came from. Eastward, the trench remained. Lombok remained unreachable. The Bali tiger survived on its island until humans hunted it to extinction in the 1930s, but it never crossed to Lombok. Not once in 2 million years of opportunities. The same pattern played out across the Sunda Shelf. Orangutans made it to Borneo and Sumatra, but stopped there. Elephants reached as far east as Java and Bali, then vanished from the fossil record. Asian monkeys spread throughout Sundaland, gibbons in the canopy, macaques in the lowlands, but east of the Wallace Line, the primate family tree drops to near zero native species. Every ice age, the pump offered the same deal. Walk east until you hit the trench, then stop. The animals followed that deal for 2.5 million years. The western side of the Wallace Line is an empire of placental mammals. These are animals that gestate their young internally for extended periods, nourishing them through a placenta until they're born relatively mature and capable. Humans, cats, elephants, bats, whales, all placentals. This reproductive strategy dominates most of the world. It's efficient, competitive, and allows for complex parental care. Tigers sit at the top of the Sundaland food web as apex predators. Below them, leopards take mid-sized prey. Deer and wild cattle provide the herbivore biomass. Pigs root in the forest floor. Primates dominate the canopy. Gibbons swinging through branches. Orangutans building nests in Borneo's dipterocarp forests. Macaques forming social troops that raid fruit trees and riverbanks. The entire system operates on a familiar ecological logic. Predators regulate herbivore populations, herbivores shape vegetation, and the forest grows dense and loud with competition. The birds follow the same Asian template. Woodpeckers excavate nest holes and probe bark for insects. These are all families that radiated out from the Asian mainland, adapted to closed canopy jungle, and spread across Sundaland when the land bridges opened. East of the Wallace Line, that template collapses. The apex predator is a reptile. The Komodo dragon is the largest living lizard, reaching over 10 feet in length and weighing upward of 200 pounds. It hunts deer, pigs, and water buffalo, using a combination of bacterial infection from its bite and patient stalking to bring down prey too large to kill outright. It is an ambush predator, cold-blooded, and evolutionarily closer to dinosaurs than to any mammal. In most ecosystems on Earth, a reptile this size would be outcompeted by mammalian carnivores. Big cats are faster, smarter, more efficient at regulating body temperature, and better at sustained pursuit. But the Komodo dragon rules Komodo, Rinca, Flores, and the surrounding islands because mammalian competition never arrived. The trench kept the tigers out. In the absence of placental predators, a Mesozoic-style body plan still works. The herbivores east of the line are equally alien to an observer coming from Bali. Instead of deer, you find marsupials. The cuscus occupies the ecological niche that monkeys fill on the western side. Slow-moving, tree-dwelling, eating leaves and fruit. But it's a pouched mammal that gestates its young for only a few weeks before transferring them to a pouch for further development. It looks superficially similar to a monkey in behavior, but the evolutionary path that created it diverged from placental mammals roughly 160 million years ago. In New Guinea, farther east, you find tree kangaroos, marsupials that adapted to climbing by repurposing a body plan designed for hopping across open plains. They're clumsy compared to monkeys, slower, less agile. They represent a lineage making do with the tools it inherited, rather than the optimized climbing machinery that primates developed independently. The bird life shifts to Australian families. Cockatoos replace barbets. Honey eaters replace sunbirds. Megapodes, those strange mound builders, take over ground nesting niches that Asian pheasants occupy on the western side. Megapodes don't incubate their eggs by sitting on them. They bury them in compost heaps or volcanic sand and let decomposition or geothermal heat do the work. When the chicks hatch, they dig themselves out and can fly within hours. No parental care. It's a strategy born from necessity in an environment where reptilian egg predators, not mammalian ones, dominate. The boundary between these two worlds, between placental and marsupial dominance, between Asian and Australian biogeography, is enforced by a geological accident. The Australian tectonic plate has been drifting north for approximately 40 million years, grinding slowly toward the Eurasian plate. The two have collided in Indonesia, crumpling the crust and creating the volcanic island chain. But the collision didn't unify them. The subduction zone between the continental shelves kept a deep water gap open, and that gap has held the line. Between the Sunda and Sahul shelves lies a scattering of islands that belong to neither continent. This is Wallacea, named for the man who first recognized its significance. These islands, Sulawesi, the Moluccas, the Lesser Sundas, Timor, Flores, were never connected to a mainland, even during the deepest glacial periods. They've been isolated for millions of years, surrounded by water too deep to drain. Only the lucky made it here, or the desperate. A species can colonize an oceanic island through swimming, flying, or rafting. Swimming limits you to strong swimmers, monitor lizards, sea snakes, crocodiles. Flying opens the door to birds, bats, and insects. Rafting is the lottery ticket. After a storm, chunks of vegetation torn from riverbanks drift out to sea. Occasionally, a small mammal clinging to the debris survives the journey. Occasionally, it reaches land. Occasionally, there's a mate already there, or another raft delivers one later. The odds are appalling, but over millions of years, appalling odds produce results. Sulawesi is the crown jewel of Wallacea. It sits roughly in the middle of the transition zone, equidistant from the Asian and Australian shelves. The island is shaped like a malformed starfish, 4 peninsulas radiating from a mountainous core, and its fauna is a catalog of evolutionary weirdness. The babirusa is a pig, but one that took a wrong turn somewhere in its ancestry. Its tusks don't curve downward like those of a typical boar. Instead, the upper canines grow upward, piercing through the skin of the snout and curving back toward the forehead. If the animal doesn't grind them down on trees, the tusks can eventually grow long enough to curve back and pierce the skull. No one is entirely sure why this trait persists. It offers no obvious advantage. It seems actively harmful. Yet here it is, a feature that evolved in isolation on an island where competition was light enough that even a poorly designed pig could survive. The anoa is a water buffalo that shrank. On the Asian mainland, water buffalo can weigh over a ton. The anoa weighs roughly 200 pounds, about the size of a large dog. This is island dwarfism, a pattern seen across isolated land masses where large mammals evolve smaller body sizes in response to limited food availability. The same process created dwarf elephants on Mediterranean islands, dwarf hippos on Madagascar, and dwarf mammoths on California's Channel Islands. Sulawesi's anoa represents an independent case of the same evolutionary pressure. 62% of Sulawesi's mammals are endemic. 27% of its birds exist nowhere else. These aren't trivial variations on mainland forms. They're distinct species that evolved in isolation after their ancestors made the 1 in a million crossing from either Asia or Australia. The island is a laboratory, showing what happens when evolutionary pressure is released and accidents are allowed to accumulate without competition filtering them out. Flores tells a darker version of the same story. It's a smaller island, farther east, and even more isolated. The dominant herbivore here for much of the Pleistocene was stegodon, a dwarf elephant, descended from mainland Asian elephants that somehow crossed the strait, possibly by swimming during a period when sea levels made the gaps shorter. Once on Flores, they shrank, just like the anoa on Sulawesi. Full-sized elephants are unsustainable on small islands. Smaller ones eat less, reproduce faster, and survive when food is scarce. But Flores held another species. In 2003, archaeologists excavating Liangbua Cave found remains of a hominin species standing approximately 3.5 feet tall. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, was not a child or a diseased individual. It was a fully adult member of a species that evolved to be small. The fossil record suggests they arrived on Flores by around 700,000 years ago, possibly descended from Homo erectus populations that built rafts or boats capable of short ocean crossings. Once on the island, the same evolutionary pressure that shrank the elephants shrank them. They persisted until roughly 50,000 years ago. Then the fossil record goes silent. Modern humans arrived in the region around the same time. Whether there was direct conflict, competition for resources, or simply bad luck is unknown. But the timing is suggestive. The Wallace Line created a refuge where an archaic human species survived hundreds of thousands of years longer than they would have on a continent. And then the refuge failed. For over 2 million years, the Wallace Line was an absolute barrier. No tiger crossed it. No elephant, no rhinoceros, no monkey that wasn't carried by humans. The marsupials and monotremes of Australia remained isolated on their continental raft, riding the slow tectonic drift northward, but never quite bridging the gap to Asia. 2 evolutionary experiments ran in parallel, separated by a few dozen miles of deep water. Then, roughly 50,000 years ago, humans crossed. The archaeological evidence is indirect but compelling. Aboriginal Australians are the descendants of people who walked out of Africa, migrated through Asia, and reached the edge of the Sunda Shelf. To continue south, they needed to cross the Wallace Line. They built boats, not rafts drifting at the mercy of storms, but intentional watercraft capable of carrying people, supplies, and the means to start fires on the far shore. They crossed the deepest channels in the Indonesian archipelago and reached Sahul, which at the time was a single landmass encompassing Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea. This makes them the first open ocean mariners in human history. The distances involved weren't trivial. Even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels, when the gaps between islands were narrower than today, some crossings required traveling over 50 miles of open water out of sight of land. You cannot drift that distance by accident. You need planning, coordination, and a level of seafaring technology that no other land mammal has ever developed. Humans broke the Wallace Line because we invented the tools to cheat geography. But the line still holds for everything else. Tigers remain west of it. Marsupials remain east of it. The Komodo dragon still rules its islands, isolated from the competition that would almost certainly outcompete it if the trench ever closed. Modern conservation efforts must respect the line. Moving an endangered Asian species east of the Wallace Line to establish a backup population sounds reasonable until you account for the fact that the eastern ecosystems evolved without those species. Introducing a placental predator to an island where reptiles hold the apex position would collapse the existing balance. The isolation that created Wallace's unique fauna is also what makes that fauna vulnerable. Mixing the two sides would destroy both. The Wallace Line exists because 40 million years ago, 2 tectonic plates collided and left a gap. That gap remained filled with water through dozens of glacial cycles, each one draining the shallow seas to the east and west, but never draining the trench between them. The result is the sharpest biological divide on Earth, a place where you can stand on one shore and see a different evolutionary world across a distance shorter than the gap between many cities, knowing that for millions of years, nothing could cross, and almost nothing ever will.